Let's keep working on our project, and in this lesson we're going to use so-called generic type to combine two pretty similar types that are defined inside types.ts file. I'm talking about the following types: activity select option interface as well as period select option. If we take a closer look at both of these types, we will see that they're pretty much similar. The only difference is that inside the first interface for the property value we're using string type, and inside the second interface for that same property we're using numeric type. So in such cases we can leverage so-called generic type. And here's how it works. I'm going to declare another interface called select option, which is going to represent both types at the same time, activity select option as well as period select option. And here, instead of hard-coding the type for the property value, we're going to use special placeholder. Usually it is called t. And so that concrete type that should be used in the place of this placeholder should be specified at the time when we're gonna use this interface. So basically in here we have to declare that this interface is the generic interface, which means it accepts one dynamic type argument. And we can do this by adding generic type argument like so by using angle brackets. And now let's find all the places where we are using activity select option interface and replace all those usages with our new interface select option. So let's take a look inside activities.ts, find all those places where activity select option interface is used, replace all these places, and use select option interface instead. But as we can see, those usages are currently highlighted because this interface is the generic one, which means we have to provide it with one type argument by using angle brackets like this and specifying the type this interface is going to use. In this case, since activity select option interface for the property value uses string, we're gonna have to pass string type like so. And let's do the same for all other places in this file. And by the way, let's try to change type of the value for this value property and use number. And right away we're seeing that TypeScript highlights this place, because earlier we have specified that the return value of this function should be an interface select option with a dynamic type, which is string. And this dynamic type is used to type the property with the name value. So in this case, TypeScript complains because we are using number instead of a string for this property. But if we would do the opposite and specify number as a dynamic type argument and using number for the value property, in this case, everything will be okay. So let's revert these changes and use string instead. And now we're gonna do pretty much the same, but for another interface, period select option. This interface is currently used inside functions.ts. So I'm going to search for all these places and replace these usages on our new dynamic interface select option. As we can see, for this interface we're gonna have to provide generic type argument, which in this case will be number. So let's get back to functions.ts and use numeric type as a generic type argument for this interface everywhere. And let's test it out. So inside the function generate period select options, I'm going to use string value for the value property. And we see an error because in this case we have to change generic type argument on string. And also, since we have specified that this function returns array of select option objects with generic type argument number, we also have to change this generic type on string to make TypeScript happy. But we have just done this for testing. Let's just revert this as it was. And now we can go back to types.ts and safely remove this unused interface period select options. We were able to combine two pretty similar interfaces into one by using generic type argument. And in addition to that, we can also specify default value for this type argument like this. And now when we are using select option interface with string generic type, we don't need to manually specify it because this type will be used by default. So again, whenever we are using select option and passing string value as a generic type, we don't need to do this anymore, so I'm going to remove all dimensions of this generic type in here. And in the end, there are a couple more places that I'd like to improve in this lesson, and that is this. Inside declaration of the state interface, we're using an anyType to type timeline items property, but since we already have a type for timeline item objects, which is called timeline item, we can leverage this interface in here and also specify square brackets, because timeline items property is going to reference array of timeline item objects. And another thing is this one. Let's take a look at the activity ID property inside timeline item interface. As we can see, we're using a union type for the activity ID, and the type can be either string or null. But we can do this actually in a little bit different way and dynamically derive the type of the ID property of activity interface. So we're using an interface and referencing its ID field. And this way we're gonna get the same result. An activity ID is of type either string or null. But now we're doing it in a little bit more dynamic fashion. And whenever we're gonna change the type of the ID property of activity interface, at the same time it is going to affect this place and dynamically change the type of activity ID property of timeline item interface, since in here we are referencing activity interface. As always, link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.